What's going on, guys? My name is Tim Roswick, and today we're talking about game mechanics. I'm going to answer the question, how many game mechanics should you have in your game? Now, I want to point out that this is one of those questions that doesn't really have a right answer, so I'm not really going to be presenting you the answer, because there's no right answer. I'm going to just be giving my opinion on stuff based on some game design that I've done, some people I've talked to, some games I've analyzed and researched, and kind of, my life history of playing different types of games. So I get questions like this a lot, and I totally understand this question because when I started in game development, it's something that I would ask. Like, I thought there was some kind of manual on how to make games. I thought there was a right number of mechanics. I thought there was a right number of levels. I thought there was you know what I mean? Like, I thought there was just a right way to make games. I thought however you make games, there's just got to be the best way to do it. And I thought it was in books. I thought it was in programs and stuff. And it turns out game design is a little more opinion based and just all over the place than actually definitive and absolute. It's a little more, I don't know, relative. It evolves over time. And some games that work now might not have worked 5 years ago, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of random stuff in the sky. But as far as game mechanics go, I feel like the best games are not the ones with the most mechanics. So if you're thinking about adding a bunch of mechanics, if you're thinking about adding a bunch of stuff to your game, I don't think the way to make the game better is always to add more mechanics to it. And real quick, just to kind of make sure we're on the same page, a mechanic to me can be as simple as the way that you jump. It can be something additional outside of your basic genre, like maybe a grappling hook, right? Like that could be an extra mechanic in your game if it's a platformer. Usually it's something additional outside the genre norm. So like, for example, if you're making an FPS, running and shooting and all that is probably there by default. It's probably stuff that you can't have an FPS without. Well, you can, but most people wouldn't make a game without that kind of stuff. But then you've got stuff like, I don't know, maybe you can edit terrain at will, right? Or there's this awesome game that I remember called PsyOps. That was one of my favorite games back in the day. It was an old game. I think it was on PlayStation. It might have even been Xbox. I don't remember. But there was a basic shooter, right? But you had psychic powers. You could lift stuff with your hands. So that I would consider that an extra mechanic. And the best games like that, the games that are most memorable for me, are games that use a singular mechanic or a singular type of mechanics, but they use them over and over again in really interesting ways. So, for example, in PsyOps, I remember there was a part where you could use your telekinesis to move guys out of the way. Then the game would teach you that you can move objects out of the way of doors. And eventually it would teach you that you could stand on objects and then use telekinesis to surf and move yourself across gaps. And I always thought that was really cool because it's using the same mechanic, but it's using it in interesting and unique ways that you weren't used to before. And I think a lot of the great games do some version of this, right? Like VVVVV, however the hell you say that name. I fucking hate that name. But it's a game about switching gravity. And it does it really well because it's not just the same old thing that you would think. It remixes it and tries it in different ways and presents all sorts of interesting puzzles and ways to play with just that simple mechanic. And so when you're picking a mechanic, at least when I'm picking a mechanic, I always like to look at how deep is it? Is it just something like super simple, like maybe jumping, Or is it something that can have a little more impact on the way that you play? For Phylophobia, this is kind of weird. This is one of those things where like the way the shadows move in my game, I'm not really sure that's a mechanic because it's not something that's like interactive, but I call it a mechanic because it changes the way that you play the game. And it's something really interesting for me to kind of implement that because I play with different ways on how that can change your playing style, how it can change the way that you play over time. And there are a lot of things in Phallophobia that I take and then I build on. So I pick a single thing like the shadow, and then I'll build on it. Later on, enemies can actually pull the shadow from you. They can pull the light source from you. You use it to kind of stop characters from seeing you later on. So, like, it's a really core part of the game. And one of the ways that I like to think about it is, like, if that part was removed, if that mechanic was removed, could you make the same game? And if the answer to that is yes, maybe your mechanic's not deep enough, right? Like, if you remove the core thing, the main mechanic, this thing from the game, and you still got a working game, either maybe you didn't implement it correctly, or the mechanic's just not that important, and maybe it's, you know, just not worth something exploring. And, you know, finding a mechanic is not easy to do. It takes a lot of working and tweaking, and, you know, we did a lot of this on Finished Friday, where we would just mess with stuff and try different ideas. Whoever had an idea in chat, I was always down to try it, because you never really know how something's going to work out until you actually get it and play test it, because your brain is a horrible emulator. You can't really emulate how well something's going to work until you actually get it in the game and play test it. So I don't necessarily think more mechanics is the answer. More mechanics can be the answer, but it's very rare. It's one of those rules that, like, for 98% of the cases, you should just follow the rule. But if you're a badass and you're a good game designer and you can figure out how to break that rule effectively, go ahead and break it. You know, like, there's no rules in game design that say you can't do it. So you can, but it's just like one of those things that, like, it's probably not the best idea. The deepest games that I've ever played in my life have been games where I play them and I experience the mechanic, and then I use the mechanic in different ways, and then I add something new to the arsenal. Like, maybe, for example, if you got a grappling hook, right? Maybe at first you can swing across gaps. That's what you can do. But then maybe later on you can grab blocks and pull them towards you. And then maybe later on you can grab blocks from below you and pull them up. Or maybe you can pull switches or pull enemies. And if you build your game out, not just with the mechanic, but you build the game and the level design and all the stuff around that central mechanic, and then you progress it as the game goes. So you don't start out with all that stuff, right? Even if you can do all that stuff, you don't really introduce it to the player. In fact, I think it's better if you can't do all this stuff, if you just slowly kind of progress, because then there feels like there's a sense of progression. But if you can start out where the player can do this basic thing, and they understand and they master that, and you build levels around the fact that they have to master swinging across gaps. You might make a gap that you can't get past without swinging across. So then they master that, and then you teach them, oh, they can move blocks. So maybe make a block a door, and they have to pull that block out of the way before they can move on. And so if you do that over a series of levels, and you really use the mechanic, and you really, like, expand on that base mechanic, I think it makes for really interesting gameplay. And I think it's one of the things that makes, honestly, a lot of indie games great, because indie games do this flawlessly. Not all of them, but a lot of the great ones do. And I think it's always something we can learn from, for sure, because it's just, there's something about that single mechanic expanding over time that's just so much more satisfying than, like, adding a bunch of random shit to it. And sure, you can add a bunch of random shit, but I just think it's less satisfying and it's less elegant than adding one core mechanic that can do a lot of different things and can interact with the world and the objects and the enemies and all this stuff in really interesting ways. And making something interactive, I think, is the important part. Like, making sure that you can use it in really interesting ways and really, you know, make it interesting to use. If it's not interesting to use, it may not be a fun game. So you got to work on that stuff. That's all I got for you today. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any opinions on what makes a game mechanic, how to make a good game mechanic, or the things that you like to see in a good game mechanic, or how many game mechanics you think should be in a game, let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to hear from you guys. But once again, I'm Tim Roswick, and I will see you again tomorrow.